My name is Staff Sergeant Numler. I am the first squad leader of 2nd Platoon Battle Company in the 117 Infantry. Today I'm going to be giving you a unclassified information brief on support of stability operations in Israel. So first we're just going to go over an agenda. First we're going to be covering the recent Israeli history, and then moving into the PMES IIPT analysis. This is how we are going to look at the conflict in Israel and the cultural, military, economic, and social aspects of Israel that encompass why we are going over there and what we need to know before we interact with their military and with their civilians. And then lastly, we are going to summarize. So first, for recent history. There have been multiple unsuccessful peace effort attempts at creating peace between Israel and Palestine. And there has been conflict and tension between these two nations for decades. But back in October of 2023, that marked Hamas's launch of the deadliest attack on Israel in history. Over 1,000 people were killed in one attack, and currently airstrikes in the Gaza Strip encompass most of the conflict as well. Efforts to defend against foreign attacks and handle national riots and protests are two different elements right now that the Israeli army, which we'll go over in our next slide, has to kind of spread themselves to cover that security and to man those defenses. So for the political and social climate, the Prime Minister of Israel, his name is Benjamin Netanyahu, is currently pushing to overthrow the Israeli judiciary, and this sparked the largest civilian protests in Israel's history, with hundreds of thousands of people taking the streets and protesting against their prime minister. The Israeli militaries now have to split their manpower, time, and money between these two conflicts, and they have to defend in Gaza and defend their people there, while also launching counterattacks and playing offense as well, and then also trying to manage security and keeping civilians safe and controlled as well. And then for the social climate, of course, there are significant social instability aspects because of the Hamas conflict and the internalized conflict between people and the government, and this has, grave impacts on families, children, and soldiers as well. Of course, soldiers have been dying. There have already been a couple thousand deaths from soldiers in the conflict in the Gaza Strip, and this impacts everyone in their nation. Next is the military and economic status. So, though the IDF, the Israel Defensive Forces, is a pretty big force comparatively to the population of Israel as a whole, they have almost 300,000 reservists, and those 300,000 reservists have been activated since October. So from a military standpoint, for the IDF, this is good. They've grown their force and they're able to manpower and send over 634,000 service members to go counterattack and defend in the Gaza Strip. How this applies to the United States and to our military and our unit is that they have sent 30,000 U.S. troops stationed in the surrounding areas of Israel. Of course, we have Iraq, Jordan, and Syria, who all surround Israel and are there in case anything happens. The U.S. has allotted over $3 billion per year to Israel defense efforts since 2021, and those have been continuing. Additionally, something else to keep in mind is back in 2023, when everything went down with Ukraine and Russia, the United States government also allotted tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine to aid in that conflict. And so looking at this from a perspective of us being in the Army, we can see how these expenses and how we have allotted warships and supplies and money to these other countries fighting each other. We now have to take into account how that might impact us as an Army and us as a United States force. There is unlikely to be any long-term effects on Israel's economy, but there are high short-term expenses to take into account. For example, when these 300,000 reservists were activated into the IDF, this was taking 300,000 people out of the civilian workforce and moving them into the Army, so that, of course, is going to have its own implications as well. Next, we have the social and religious status and information. So, social instability throughout Israel, and this has a large impact on civilians and families, as mentioned before. The religious tension between the primarily Jewish Israel and the Muslim Palestine and Hamas leads to greater tension over the land, and that has kind of been the primary source of the conflict ever since the end of World War II, when the Jews were given permission and they were given that piece of land to occupy and move out of the countries where they were heavily discriminated against, and that religious tension between those two groups has cost thousands of lives, and it's continuing to stir regardless of the peace efforts that have been made between both nations. Additionally, on top of information coming back to the U.S. and to our military as well, information spread about the conflict between Israel and Hamas is difficult to navigate because so much of it is false or taken out of context. For example, a few weeks ago, there was a whole bunch of information put out on the news, CNN, Fox, and NBC about how Israel had bombed a civilian hospital in Palestine, when really what had happened was Hamas had launched an attack and misfired the missile, and it hit into the parking lot of a hospital in Palestine. So a lot of the information that civilians, especially in the United States, are receiving is not necessarily entirely true. And it's also difficult to measure, on top of that, the exact amount of civilian soldier deaths on each side, as reports can be biased and politically charged. Lastly, to go into a summary here, there have been multiple peace attempts to decrease the hostility between Israel and Palestine, and no formal peace exists. In October, the Palestinian militant group Hamas launched the most deadly attack in history, killing over 1,000 people in that one attack. The airstrikes occurring primarily in the Gaza Strip have been devastating to both civilian populations in Palestine and in Israel. And on top of the efforts to defend against the Hamas attacks, the political climate in Israel also poses a threat to the stability of the nation as well. And the implications of these conflicts were addressed in this brief using the PMES-IIPT analysis to best prepare for support of stability operations in Israel. Thank you very much.